Chapter 1 of The Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Charles Bice. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 1. A Sermon on Inns. The sea was a pale elfin green, and the afternoon had already felt the fairy touch of evening as a young woman with dark hair, dressed in a crinkly copper-colored sort of dress of the artistic order, was walking rather listlessly along the parade of Pebblewick-on-Sea, trailing a parasol and looking out upon the sea's horizon. She had a reason for looking instinctively out at the sea-line, a reason that many young women have had in the history of the world. But there was no sail in sight. On the beach below the parade were a succession of small crowds surrounding the usual orators of the seaside. Whether niggers or socialists, whether clowns or clergymen, here would stand a man doing something or other with paper boxes, and the holiday makers would watch him for hours in the hope of sometime knowing what it was that he was doing with them. Next to him would be a man in a top hat with a very big Bible and a very small wife, who stood silently beside him while he fought with his clenched fist against the heresy of the Milnian Suplacerianism, so widespread in fashionable watering places. It was not easy to follow him, he was so very much excited, but every now and then the words, "Our Suplacerian friends," would recur with a kind of wailing sneer. Next was a young man talking of nobody knew what, least of all himself, but apparently relying for public favor mainly on having a ring of carrots round his hat. He had more money lying in front of him than the others. Next were niggers. Next was a children's service conducted by a man with a long neck who beat time with a little wooden spade. Farther along there was an atheist in a towering rage who pointed every now and then at the children's service and spoke of nature's fairest things being corrupted with the secrets of the Spanish Inquisition, by the man with the little spade, of course. The atheist, who wore a red rosette, was very withering to his own audience as well. "Hypocrites," he would say, and then they would throw him money. "Dupes and dastards," and then they would throw him more money. But between the atheist and the children's service was a little owlish man in a red fez, weakly waving a green gamp umbrella. His face was brown and wrinkled like a walnut. His nose was the sort we associate with Judea. His beard was the sort of black wedge we associate rather with Persia. The young woman had never seen him before. He was a new exhibit in the now familiar museum of cranks and quacks. The young woman was one of those people in whom a real sense of humor is always at issue with a certain temperamental tendency to boredom or melancholia, and she lingered a moment and leaned on the rail to listen. It was fully 4 minutes before she could understand a word the man was saying. He spoke English with so extraordinary an accent that she supposed at first that he was talking in his own Oriental tongue. All the noises of that articulation were odd. The most marked was an extreme prolongation of the short U into oo, as in poot for put. Gradually the girl got used to the dialect and began to understand the words, though some time elapsed even then before she could form any conjecture of their subject matter. Eventually it appeared to her that he had some fad about English civilization having been founded by the Turks, or perhaps by the Saracens after their victory in the Crusades. He also seemed to think that Englishmen would soon return to this way of thinking, and seemed to be urging the spread of teetotalism as an evidence of it. The girl was the only person listening to him. "Look," he said, wagging a curled brown finger. "Look at your own inns," which he pronounced as inns. "Your inns, of which you write in your books. Those inns were not put up in the beginning to sell the alcoholic Christian drink. They were put up to sell the non-alcoholic Islamic drinks. You can see this in the names of your inns. They are Eastern names, Asiatic names. You have a famous public house to which your omnibuses go on the pilgrimage. It is called the Elephant and Castle. This is not an English name. This is an Asiatic name. You will say there are castles in England, and I will agree with you. There is the Windsor Castle, but where? He cried, sternly shaking his green umbrella at the girl in an angry oratorical triumph. Where is the Windsor Elephant? I have searched all Windsor Park. No elephants. The girl with the dark hair smiled, and began to think that this man was better than any of the others. In accordance with the strange system of concurrent religious endowment which prevails at watering places, she dropped a 2-shilling piece into the round copper tray beside him. With honorable and disinterested eagerness, the old man in the red fez took no notice of this, but went on warmly, if obscurely, with his argument. Then you have a place of drink in this town which you call the Bull. We generally call it the Bull, said the interested young lady with a very melodious voice. You have a place of drink which you call the Bull, he reiterated in a sort of abstract fury, and surely you see that this is all very ridiculous. No, no, said the girl softly and in deprecation. Why should there be a Bull? He cried, prolonging the words in his own way. Why should there be a bull in connection with a festive locality? Who thinks about a bull in gardens of delight? What need is there of a bull when we watch the tulip-tinted maidens dance or pour the sparkling sherbet? You yourselves, my friends? And he looked around radiantly, as if addressing an enormous mob. You yourselves have a proverb. It is not calculated to promote prosperity to have a bull in a china shop. Equally, my friends, it would not be calculated to promote prosperity to have a bull in a wine shop. All this is clear. He stuck his umbrella upright in the sand and struck one finger against another, like a man getting to business at last. It is as clear as the sun at noon, he said solemnly. It is as clear as the sun at noon that this word bull, which is devoid of restful and pleasurable associations, is but the corruption of another word which possesses restful and pleasurable associations. The word is not bull, it is the bulbul. His voice rose suddenly like a trumpet, and he spread abroad his hands like the fans of a tropic palm tree. After this great effort, he was a little more subdued, and leaned gravely on his umbrella. You will find the same trace of Asiatic nomenclature in the names of all your English inns, he went on. Nay, you will find it, I am almost certain, in all your terms in any way connected with your revelries and your reposes. Why, my good friends, the very name of that insidious spirit by which you make strong your drinks is an Arabic word, alcohol. It is obvious, is it not, that this is the Arabic article al, as in Alhambra, as in algebra. And we need not pause here to pursue its many appearances in connection with your festive institutions, as in your Alsop's beer, your Ali Sloper, and your partly joyous institution of the Albert Memorial. Above all, in your greatest feasting day, your Christmas Day, which you so erroneously suppose to be connected with your religion. What do you say then? Do you say the names of the Christian nations? Do you say, I will have a little France, I will have a little Ireland, I will have a little Scotland, I will have a little Spain? No. And the noise of the negative seemed to waggle as does the bleating of a sheep. You say,
I will have a little turkey, which is your name for the country of the servant of the prophet."
And once more he stretched out his arms sublimely to the east and west and appealed to earth and heaven. The young lady, looking at the sea-green horizon with a smile, clapped her grey-gloved hands softly together as if at a peroration. But the little old man with the fez was far from exhausted yet.
"In reply to this, you will object," he began.
"Oh, no, no," breathed the young lady in a sort of dreamy rapture. "I don't object the littlest bit."
"In reply to this, you will object," proceeded her preceptor, "that some inns are actually named after the symbols of your national superstitions. You will hasten to point out to me that the Golden Cross is situated opposite Charing Cross, and you will expatiate at length on King's Cross, Gerrard's Cross, and the many crosses that are to be found in or near London. But you must not forget,"
and here he wagged his green umbrella roguishly at the girl, as if he was going to poke her with it,
"none of you, my friends, must forget what a large number of crescents there are in London. Denmark Crescent, Mornington Crescent, St. Mark's Crescent, St. George's Crescent, Grosvenor Crescent, Regent's Park Crescent, nay, Royal Crescent. And why should we forget Pelham Crescent? Why, indeed, everywhere, I say, homage paid to the holy symbol of the religion of the prophet. Compare with this network and pattern of crescents, this city almost consisting of crescents, the meager array of crosses which remain to attest the ephemeral superstition to which you were for one weak moment inclined."
The crowds on the beach were rapidly thinning as tea-time drew nearer. The west grew clearer and clearer with the evening, till the sunshine seemed to have got behind the pale green sea and be shining through, as through a wall of thin green glass. The very transparency of sky and sea might have to this girl, for whom the sea was the romance and the tragedy, the hint of a sort of radiant hopelessness. The flood made of 1,000,000 emeralds was ebbing as slowly as the sun was sinking, but the river of human nonsense flowed on forever.
"I will not for one moment maintain," said the old gentleman, "that there are no difficulties in my case, or that all the examples are as obviously true as those that I have just demonstrated. No. It is obvious, let us say, that the Saracen's Head is a corruption of the historic truth. The Saracen is a head. I am far from saying it is equally obvious that the Green Dragon was originally the agreeing dragoman, though I hope to prove in my book that it is so. I will only say here that it is surely more probable that one putting himself forward to attract the wayfarer in the desert would compare himself to a friendly and persuadable guide or courier, rather than to a voracious monster. Sometimes the true origin is very hard to trace, as in the inn that commemorates our great Moslem warrior, Amir Ali Benbows, whom you have so quaintly abbreviated into Admiral Benbow. Sometimes it is even more difficult for the seeker after truth. There is a place of drink near to here called the Old Ship.
The eyes of the girl remained on the ring of the horizon, as rigid as the ring itself, but her whole face had colored and altered. The sands were almost emptied by now. The atheist was as non-existent as his God, and those who had hoped to know what was being done to paper boxes had gone away to their tea without knowing it. Her face was suddenly alive, and it looked as if her body could not move.
"It should be admitted," bleated the old man with the green umbrella, "that there is no literally self-evident trace of the Asiatic nomenclature in the words 'the old ship.' But even here the seeker after truth can put himself in touch with facts. I questioned the proprietor of the old ship, who is, according to such notes as I have kept, a Mr. Pumph." The girl's lip trembled. "Poor old Hump," she said. "Why, I'd forgotten about him. He must be very nearly as worried as I am. I hope this man won't be too silly about this. I'd rather it weren't about this." "And Mr. Pumph told me the inn was named by a very intimate friend of his, an Irishman who had been a captain in the Britannic Royal Navy, but had resigned his post in anger at the treatment of Ireland. Though quitting the service, he retained just enough of the superstition of your western sailors to wish his friend's inn to be named after his old ship. But as the name of the old ship was the United Kingdom," his female pupil, if she could not exactly be said to be sitting at his feet, was undoubtedly leaning out very eagerly above his head. Amid the solitude of the sands she called out in a loud and clear voice, "Can you tell me the captain's name?" The old gentleman jumped, blinked, and stared like a startled owl. Having been talking for hours as if he had an audience of thousands, he seemed suddenly very much embarrassed to find that he had even an audience of one. By this time they seemed to be almost the only human creatures along the shore, almost the only living creatures except the seagulls. The sun, in dropping finally, seemed to have broken as a blood orange might break, and lines of blood-red light were split along the split, low, level skies. This abrupt and belated brilliance took all the color out of the man's red cap and green umbrella, but his dark figure, distinct against the sea and the sunset, remained the same, save that it was more agitated than before. "The name?" he said. "The captain's name? I understood it was Dalroy. But what I wish to indicate, what I wish to expound, is that here again the seeker after truth can find the connection of his ideas. It was explained to me by Mr. Pumph that he was rearranging the place of festivity in no inconsiderable proportion because of the anticipated return of the captain in question, who had, as it appeared, taken service in some not very large navy, but had left it and was coming home. Now mark all of you, my friends," he said to the seagulls, "that even here the chain of logic holds." He said it to the seagulls because the young lady, after staring at him with starry eyes for a moment, and leaning heavily on the railing, had turned her back and disappeared rapidly into the twilight. After her hasty steps had fallen silent, there was no other noise than the faint but powerful purring of the now distant sea, the occasional shriek of a sea-bird, and the continuous sound of a soliloquy. "Mark all of you," continued the man, flourishing his green umbrella so furiously that it almost flew open like a green flag unfurled, and then striking it deep in the sand in which his fighting fathers had so often struck their tents. "Mark all of you this marvelous fact, that when being for a time astonished, embarrassed, brought up, as you would say, short, by the absence of any absolute evidence of Eastern influence in the phrase, 'the old ship,' I inquired from what country the captain was returning. Mr. Pumph said to me in solemnity, 'From Turkey. From Turkey, from the nearest country of the religion.' I know men say it is not our country, that no man knows where we come from, of what is our country. What does it matter where we come from if we carry a message from paradise? With a great galloping of horses we carry it, and have no time to stop in places. But what we bring is the only creed that has regarded what you will call in your great words the virginity of man's reason, that has put no man higher than a prophet, and has respected the solitude of God."
And again he spread his arms out, as if addressing a mass meeting of millions, all alone on the dark seashore. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Charles Bice. www.charlesbice.com. Courtesy of Wimabi Press.
Of the Flying In. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicola Kay. The Flying In by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 2. The End of Olive Island. The great sea dragon of the changing colours that wriggles round the world like a chameleon was pale green as it washed on Pebblewick, but strong blue where it broke on the Ionian Isles. One of the innumerable islets, hardly more than a flat white rock in the azure expanse, was celebrated as the Isle of Olives, not because it was rich in such vegetation, but because by some freak of soil or climate 2 or 3 little olives grew there to an unparalleled height. Even in the full heat of the south it is very unusual for an olive tree to grow any taller than a small pear tree. But the 3 olives that stood up as signals on this sterile place might well be mistaken, except for the shape, for moderate-sized pines or larches of the north. It was also connected with some ancient Greek legend about Pallas, the patroness of the olive. For all that sea was alive with the first fairyland of Hellas, and from the platform of marble under the olive trees could be seen the grey outline of Ithaca. On the island and under the trees was a table set in the open air, and covered with papers and inkstands. At the table were sitting 4 men, 2 in uniform and 2 in plain black clothes. Aides-de-camp, equerries, and such persons stood in a group in the background, and behind them a string of 2 or 3 silent battleships lay along the sea, for peace was being given to Europe. There had just come to an end the long agony of one of the many unsuccessful efforts to break the strength of Turkey and save the small Christian tribes. There had been many other such meetings in the later phases of the matter as one after another the small nations gave up the struggle or the greater nations came in to coerce them. But the interested parties had now dwindled to these 4. For the powers of Europe, being entirely agreed on the necessity for peace on a Turkish basis, were content to leave the last negotiations to England and Germany, who could be trusted to enforce it. There was a representative of the Sultan, of course, and there was a representative of the only enemy of the Sultan who had not hitherto come to terms. For one tiny power had alone carried on the war month after month, and with a tenacity and temporary success that was a new 9 days' marvel every morning. An obscure and scarcely recognized prince, calling himself the King of Ithaca, had filled the eastern Mediterranean with exploits that were not unworthy of the audacious parallel that the name of his island suggested. Poets could not help asking if it were Odysseus come again. Patriotic Greeks, even if they themselves had been forced to lay down their arms, could not help feeling curious as to what Greek race or name was boasted by the new and heroic royal house. It was therefore with some amusement that the world at last discovered that the descendant of Ulysses was a cheeky Irish adventurer named Patrick Dalroy, who had once been in the English navy, had gotten into a quarrel through his Fenian sympathies, and resigned his commission. Since then he had seen many adventures in many uniforms, and always got himself or someone else into hot water with an extraordinary mixture of cynicism and quixotry. In his fantastic little kingdom, of course, he had been his own general, his own admiral, his own foreign secretary, and his own ambassador. But he was always careful to follow the wishes of his people in the essentials of peace and war. And it was at their direction that he had come to lay down his sword at last. Besides his professional skill, he was chiefly famous for his enormous bodily strength and stature, It is the custom in newspapers nowadays to say that mere barbaric muscular power is valueless in modern military actions, but this view may be as much exaggerated as its opposite. In such wars as these of the Near East, where whole populations are slightly armed and personal assault is common, a leader who can defend his head often has a real advantage. And it is not true, even in a general way, that strength is of no use. This was admitted by Lord Ivywood, the English minister, who was pointing out in detail to King Patrick the hopeless superiority of the light pattern of Turkish field gun. And the King of Ithaca, remarking that he was quite convinced, said he would take it with him, and ran away with it under his arm. It would be conceded by the greatest of the Turkish warriors, the terrifying Oman Pasha, equally famous for his courage in war and his cruelty in peace, but who carried on his brow a scar from Patrick's sword, taken after 3 hours' mortal combat, and taken without spite or shame, be it said, for the Turk is always at his best in that game. Nor would the quality be doubted by Mr. Hart, a financial friend of the German minister whom Patrick Dalroy, after asking him which of his front windows he would prefer to be thrown into, threw into his bedroom window on the first floor with so considerate an exactitude that he alighted on the bed, where he was in a position to receive any medical attention. But when all is said, one muscular Irish gentleman on an island cannot fight all Europe for ever, and he came with a kind of gloomy good humour to offer the terms now dictated to him by his adopted country. He could not even knock all the diplomatists down, for which he possessed both the power and the inclination, for he realized with the juster part of his mind that they were only obeying orders, as he was. So he sat heavily and sleepily at the little table, in the green and white uniform of the Navy of Ithaca, invented by himself. A big bull of a man, monstrously young for his size, with a bull neck and 2 blue bull's eyes for eyes, and red hair rising so steadily off his scalp that it looked as if his head had caught fire, as some said it had. The most dominant person present was the great Oman Pasha himself, with his strong face starved by the asceticism of war, his hair and moustache seeming rather blasted with lightning than blanched with age, a red fez on his head, and between the red fez and moustache, a scar at which the King of Ithaca did not look. His eyes had an awful lack of expression. Lord Ivywood, the English minister, was probably the handsomest man in England, save that he was almost colourless both in hair and complexion. Against that blue marble sea he might almost have been one of its old marble statues that are faultless in line, but show nothing but shades of grey or white. It seemed a mere matter of the luck of lighting, whether his hair looked dull silver or pale brown, and his splendid mask never changed in colour or expression. He was one of the last of the old parliamentary orators, and yet he was probably a comparatively young man. He could make anything he had to mention blossom into verbal beauty, yet his face remained dead while his lips were alive. He had little old-fashioned ways, as out of old parliaments. For instance, he would always stand up, as in a senate, to speak to those 3 other men alone on a rock in the ocean. In all this he perhaps appeared more personal in contrast to the man sitting next to him, who never spoke at all, but whose face seemed to speak for him. He was Dr. Gluck, the German minister, whose face had nothing German about it, neither the German vision nor the German sleep. His face was as vivid as a highly coloured photograph and altered like a cinema, but his scarlet lips never moved in speech. His almond eyes seemed to shine with all the shifting fires of the opal. His small, curled black moustache seemed sometimes almost to hoist itself afresh, like a live black snake. But there came from him no sound. He put a paper in front of Lord Ivywood. Lord Ivywood took a pair of eyeglasses to read it, and looked 10 years older by the act. It was merely a statement of agenda, of the few last things to be settled at this last conference. The first item ran: The Ithacan ambassador asks that the girls taken to harems after the capture of Pylos be restored to their families. This cannot be granted." Lord Ivywood rose. The mere beauty of his voice startled everyone who had not heard it before. "Your Excellencies and gentlemen," he said, "a statement to whose policy I by no means assent, but to whose historic status I could not conceivably aspire, has familiarized you with a phrase about peace with honor. But when we have to celebrate a peace between such historic soldiers as Oman Pasha and His Majesty the King of Ithaca, I think we may say that it is peace with glory." He paused for half an instant. Yet even the silence of sea and rock seemed full of multitudinous applause, so perfectly had the words been spoken. "I think there is but one thought among us, whatever our many just objections through these long and harassing months of negotiations. I think there is but one thought now. That the peace may be as full as the war, that the peace may be as fearless as the war." Once more he paused an instant, and felt a phantom clapping, as it were, not from the hands, but the heads of the men. He went on. "If we are to leave off fighting, we may surely leave off haggling. A statute of limitations, or, if you will, an amnesty, is surely proper when so sublime a peace seals so sublime a struggle. And if there be anything in which an old diplomatist may advise you, I would most strongly say this, that there should be no new disturbance of whatever amicable or domestic ties have been formed during this disturbed time. I will admit I am sufficiently old-fashioned to think any interference with the interior life of the family a precedent of no little peril. Nor will I be so illiberal as not to extend to the ancient customs of Islam what I would extend to the ancient customs of Christianity. A suggestion has been brought before us that we should enter into a renewed war of recrimination as to whether certain women have left their homes with or without their own consent. I can conceive no controversy more perilous to begin or more impossible to conclude. I will venture to say that I express all your thoughts when I say that, whatever wrongs may have been wrought on either side, the homes, the marriages, the family arrangements of this great Ottoman Empire shall remain as they are today." No one moved except Patrick Dalroy, who put his hand on his sword hilt for a moment and looked at them all with bursting eyes. Then his hand fell and he laughed out loud and sudden. Lord Ivywood took no notice, but picked up the agenda paper again, and again fitted on the glasses that made him look older. He read the second item, needless to say, not aloud. The German minister with the far from German face had written this note for him. "Both Coote and the Bemsteins insist there must be Chinese for the marble. Greeks cannot be trusted in the quarries just now. But while," continued Lord Ivywood, "we desire these fundamental institutions, such as the Moslem family, to remain as they are even at this moment, we do not assent to social stagnation, nor do we say for one moment that the great tradition of Islam is capable alone of sustaining the necessities of the Near East. But I would seriously ask your Excellencies, why should we be so vain as to suppose that the only cure for the Near East is of necessity the Near West? If new ideas are needed, if new blood is needed, would it not be more natural to appeal to those most laborious civilizations which form the vast reserve of the Orient? Asia in Europe, if my friend Oman Pasha will allow me the criticism, has hitherto been Asia in arms. May we not yet see Asia in Europe and yet Asia in peace? These at least are the reasons which lead me to consent to a scheme of colonization." Patrick Dalroy sprang erect, pulling himself out of his seat by clutching at an olive branch above his head. He steadied himself by putting one hand on the trunk of the tree, and simply stared at them all. There fell on him the huge helplessness of mere physical power. He could throw them into the sea. But what good would that do? more men on the wrong side would be accredited to the diplomatic campaign, and the only man on the right side would be discredited for anything. He shook the branching olive tree above him in his fury. But he did not for one moment disturb Lord Ivywood, who had just read the third item on his private agenda. Oman Pasha insists on the destruction of the vineyards, and was by this time engaged in a peroration which afterwards became famous and may be found in many rhetorical textbooks and primers. He was well into the middle of it before Dalroy's rage and wonder allowed him to follow the words. "Do we indeed owe nothing," the diplomatist was saying, "to that gesture of high refusal in which so many centuries ago the great Arabian mystic put the wine-cup from his lips? Do we owe nothing to the long vigil of a valiant race, the long fast by which they have testified against the venomous beauty of the vine? Ours is an age when men come more and more to see that the creeds hold treasures for each other, that each religion has a secret for its neighbour, that faith unto faith uttereth speech, and church unto church showeth knowledge. If it be true, and I claim again the indulgence of Oman Pasha when I say I think it is true, that we of the West have brought some light to Islam in the matter of the preciousness of peace and of civil order, may we not say that Islam in answer shall give us peace in 1,000 homes, and encourage us to cut down that curse that has done so much to thwart and madden the virtues of Western Christendom? Already in my own country the orgies that made horrible the nights of the noblest families are no more. Already the legislature takes more and more sweeping action to deliver the populace from the bondage of the all-destroying drug. Surely the prophet of Mecca is reaping his harvest. The cession of the disputed vineyards to the greatest of his champions is of all acts the most appropriate to this day. To this happy day that may yet deliver the East from the curse of war, and the West from the curse of wine. The gallant prince who meets us here at last, to offer an olive branch even more glorious than his sword, may well have our sympathy if he himself views the cession with some sentimental regret. But I have little doubt that he also will live to rejoice in it at last. And I would remind you that it is not the vine alone that has been the sign of the glory of the South. There is another sacred tree, unstained by loose and violent memories, guiltless of the blood of Pentheus, or of Orpheus and the broken lyre. We shall pass from this place in a little while, as all things pass and perish. Far called, our navies melt away. On dune and headland sinks the fire, and all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. But so long as sun can shine and soil can nourish, happier men and women after us shall look on this lovely islet, and it shall tell its own story. For they shall see these 3 holy olive trees lifted in everlasting benediction over the humble spot out of which came the peace of the world. The other 2 men were staring at Patrick Dalroy. His hand had tightened on the tree, and a giant billow of effort went over his broad breast. A small stone jerked itself out of the ground at the foot of the tree as if it were a grasshopper jumping. And then the coiled roots of the olive tree rose very slowly out of the earth, like the limbs of a dragon lifting itself from sleep. "I offer an olive branch," said the king of Ithaca, totteringly leaning the loose tree, so that its vast shadow, much larger than itself, fell across the whole council. "An olive branch," he gasped, "more glorious than my sword, also heavier." Then he made another effort and tossed it into the sea below. The German, who was no German, had put up his arm in apprehension when the shadow fell across him. Now he got up and edged away from the table, seeing that the wild Irishman was tearing up the second tree. This one came out more easily, and before he flung it after the first, he stood with it a moment, looking like a man juggling with a tower. Lord Ivywood showed more firmness, but he rose in tremendous remonstrance. Only the Turkish Pasha still sat with blank eyes, immovable. Dalroy rent out the last tree and hurled it, leaving the island bare. "There," said Dalroy, when the third and last olive had splashed in the tide. "Now I will go. I have seen something today that is worse than death, and the name of it is peace." Oman Pasha rose and held out his hand. "You are right," he said in French, "and I hope we meet again in the only life that is a good life. Where are you going now?" "I am going," said Dalroy dreamily, "to the old ship." "Do you mean," asked the Turk, "that you are going back to the warships of the English king?" "No," answered the other, "I am going back to the old ship that is behind the apple trees by Pebblewick, where the Yule flows among the trees. I fear I shall never see you there." After an instant's hesitation, he wrung the red hand of the great tyrant, and walked to his boat without a glance at the diplomatists. End of chapter 2. Recording by Nicola K. Of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicola K. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 3. The Sign of the Old Ship. Upon few of the children of men has the surname of Pump fallen, and of these few have been maddened into naming a child Humphrey in addition to it. To such extremity, however, had the parents of the innkeeper at the Old Ship proceeded, that their son might come at last to be called Hump by his dearest friends, and Pump by an aged Turk with a green umbrella. All this, or all he knew of it, he endured with a sour smile, for he was of a stoical temper. Mr. Humphrey Pump stood outside his inn, which stood almost on the seashore, screened only by one line of apple trees, dwarfed, twisted, and salted by the sea air. But in front of it was a highly banked bowling green, and behind it the land sank abruptly, so that one very steep, sweeping road vanished into the depth and mystery of taller trees. Mr. Pump was standing immediately under his trim sign, which stood erect in the turf. A wooden pole painted white, and suspending a square white board, also painted white but further decorated with a highly grotesque blue ship, such as a child might draw, but into which Mr. Pump's patriotism had insinuated a disproportionately large red St. George's cross. Mr. Humphrey Pump was a man of middle size, with very broad shoulders, wearing a sort of shooting suit with gaiters. Indeed, he was engaged at the moment in cleaning and reloading a double-barreled gun, a short but powerful weapon which he had invented, or at least improved, himself, and which, though eccentric enough as compared with latest scientific arms, was neither clumsy nor necessarily out of date. For Pump was one of those handy men who seem to have 100 hands like Briareus. He made nearly everything for himself, and everything in his house was slightly different from the same thing in anyone else's house. He was also as cunning as Pan, or a poacher in everything affecting every bird or dish, every leaf or berry in the woods. His mind was a rich soil of subconscious memories and traditions, and he had a curious kind of gossip so elusive as to almost amount to reticence, for he always took it for granted that everyone knew his county and its tales as intimately as he did. So he would mention the most mysterious and amazing things without relaxing a muscle on his face, which seemed to be made of knotted wood. His dark brown hair ended in 2 rudimentary side whiskers, giving him a slightly horsey look, but in the old-fashioned sportsman's style. His smile was rather wry and crabbed, but his brown eyes were kindly and soft. He was very English. As a rule, his movements, though quick, were cool. and on this occasion he put down the gun on the table outside the inn in a rather hurried manner, and came forward dusting his hands in an unusual degree of animation and even defiance. Beyond the goblin green apple trees and against the sea had appeared the tall slight figure of a girl, in a dress about the colour of copper and a large shady hat. Under the hat her face was grave and beautiful, though rather swarthy. She shook hands with Mr. Pump. Then he very ceremoniously put a chair for her and called her Lady Joan. "I thought I would like a look at the old place," she said. "We have had some happy times here when we were boys and girls. I suppose you hardly see any of your old friends now." "Very little," answered Pump, rubbing his short whisker reflectively. "Lord Ivywood's become quite a Methody parson, you know, since he took the place. He's pulling down beer shops right and left. And Mr. Charles was sent to Australia for lying down flat at the funeral. Pretty stiff, I call it. But the old lady was a terror." "Do you ever hear," asked Lady Joan Brett carelessly, "of that Irishman, Captain Dalroy?" "Yes, more often than from the rest," answered the innkeeper. "He seems to have done wonders in this Greek business. Ah, he was a sad loss to the Navy." "They insulted his country," said the girl, looking at the sea with heightened colour. "After all, Ireland was his country, and he had a right to resent it being spoken of like that." "And when they found he'd painted him green," went on Mr. Pump. "Painted him what?" asked Lady Joan. "Painted Captain Dawson green," continued Mr. Pump in colourless tones. "Captain Dawson said green was the colour of Irish traitors, so Dalroy painted him green. It was a great temptation, no doubt, with this fence being painted at the time and the pail of stuff there, but of course it had a very prejudicial effect on his professional career." "What an extraordinary story," said the staring Lady Joan, breaking into rather joyless laugh. "It must go down among your county legends. I never heard that version before. Why, it might be the origin of the Green Man over there by the town." "Oh no," said Pump simply. "That's been there since before Waterloo times. Poor old Noyle had it until they put him away. You remember old Noyle, Lady Joan. Still alive, I hear, and still writing love letters to Queen Victoria. Only of course they aren't posted now." "Have you heard from your Irish friend lately?" asked the girl, keeping a steady eye on the skyline. "Yes, I had a letter last week," answered the innkeeper. "It seems not impossible that he may return to England. He's been acting for one of these Greek places, and the negotiations seem to be concluded. It's a queer thing that his lordship himself was the English minister in charge of them." "You mean Lord Ivywood?" said Lady Joan rather coldly. "Yes, he has a great career before him, evidently." "I wish he hadn't got his knife into us so much," chuckled Pump. "I don't believe there'll be an inn left in England. But the Ivywoods were always cranky. It's only fair to him to remember his grandfather." "I think it's very ungallant on your part," said Lady Joan with a mournful smile, "to ask a lady to remember his grandfather." "You know what I mean, Lady Joan," said her host good-humouredly. "And I never was hard on the case myself. We all have our little ways. I shouldn't like it done to my pig, but I don't see why a man shouldn't have his own pig in his own pew with him if he likes it. It wasn't a free seat, it was the family pew." Lady Joan broke out laughing again. "What horrible things you do seem to have heard of," she said. "Well, I must be going, Mr. Pump. I used to call you Hump. Oh, Hump, do you ever think any of us will ever be happy again?" "I suppose it rests with Providence," he said, looking at the sea. "Oh, do say Providence again," cried the girl. "It's as good as Masterman Ready." With which inconsequent words she betook herself again to the path by the apple trees and walked back to the sea front to Pebblewick. The inn of the Old Ship lay a little beyond the old fishing village of Pebblewick, and that again was separated by an empty half-mile or so from the new watering place of Pebblewick on Sea. But the dark-haired lady walked steadily along the sea front on a sort of parade which had been stretched out to east and west in the insane optimism of watering places, and as she approached the more crowded part, looked more and more carefully at the groups on the beach. Most of them were much the same as she had seen them more than a month before. The seekers after truth, as the man in the fez would say, who assembled daily to find out what the man was doing with the paper boxes, had not found out yet. Neither had they wearied of their intellectual pilgrimage. Pennies were still thrown to the thundering atheist in acknowledgment of his incessant abuse, and this was all the more mysterious because the crowd was obviously indifferent, and the atheist was obviously sincere. The man with the long neck, who led low church hymns with a little wooden spade, had indeed disappeared. For children's services of this kind are generally a moving feast. But the man whose only claim consisted of carrots round his hat was still there, and seemed to have even more money than before. But Lady Joan could see no sign of the little old man in the fez. She could only suppose that he had failed entirely, and being in a bitter mood, she told herself bitterly that he had sunk out of sight, precisely because there was in his rubbish a touch of unearthly and insane clear-headedness, of which all these vulgar idiots were incapable. She did not confess to herself consciously that what had made both the man in the fez and the man at the inn interesting was the subject of which they had spoken. As she walked on rather wearily along the parade, she caught sight of a girl in black with faint, fair hair and a tremulous, intelligent face, which she was sure she had seen before. Pulling together all her aristocratic training for the remembering of middle-class people, she managed to remember that this was a Miss Browning who had done typewriting work for her a year or two before, and immediately went forward to greet her, partly out of genuine good nature, and partly as a relief from her own rather dreary thoughts. Her tone was so seriously frank and friendly that the lady in black summoned the social courage to say, "I've so often wanted to introduce you to my sister, who's much cleverer than I am, though she does live at home, which I suppose is very old-fashioned. She knows all sorts of intellectual people. She's talking to one of them now, this prophet of the moon that everyone's talking about. Do let me introduce you." Lady Joan Brett had met many prophets of the moon and of other things, but she had the spontaneous courtesy which redeems the vices of her class, and she followed Miss Browning to a seat on the parade. She greeted Miss Browning's sister with glowing politeness, and this may really be counted to her credit, for she had great difficulty in looking at Miss Browning's sister at all. For on the seat beside her, still in a red fez but in a brilliantly new black frock coat, and every appearance of prosperity, sat the old gentleman who had lectured on the sands about the inns of England. "He lectured at our Ethical Society," whispered Miss Browning, "on the word alcohol. Just on the word alcohol. He was perfectly thrilling. All about Arabia and algebra, you know, and how everything comes from the East. You really would be interested." "I am interested," said Lady Joan. "Put it to yourselves," the man in the fez was saying to Miss Browning's sister, "just what sort of meaning the names of your inns can have if they do not commemorate the unlimitable influence of Islam. There is a very populous inn in London, one of the most distinguished, one of the most of the centre, and it is called the Horseshoe. Now, my friends, why should anyone commemorate a horseshoe? It is but an appendage to a creature more interesting than itself. I have already demonstrated to you that the very fact that you have in your town a place of drink called the Bool—" "I should like to ask," began Lady Joan suddenly. "A place of drink called the Bool," went on the man in the fez, deaf to all distractions, "and I have urged that the Bool is a disturbing thought, while the Bool is a reassuring thought. But even you, my friends, would not name a place after a ring in a bull's nose, and not after the Bool. Why then name an equivalent place after the shoe, the mere shoe upon a horse's hoof, and not after the noble horse? Surely it is clear, surely it is evident that the term horseshoe is a cryptic term, an esoteric term, a term made during the days when the ancient Moslem faith of this English country was oppressed by the passing superstition of the Galileans. That bent shape, that duplex curving shape which you call horseshoe, is it not clearly the crescent? And he cast his arms wide as he had done on the sands. The crescent of the prophet of the only God. "I should like to ask," began Lady Joan again, "how you would explain the name of the inn called the Green Man, just behind that row of houses." "Exactly! Exactly!" cried the Prophet of the Moon in an almost insane excitement. "The seeker after truth could not at all probably find a more perfect example of these principles. My friends, how could there be a green man? You are acquainted with green grass, with green leaves, with green cheese, and with green chartreuse. I ask if any one of you, however wide her social circle, has ever been acquainted with a green man? Surely, surely it is evident, my friends, that this is an imperfect version, an abbreviated version of the original words. What can be clearer than that the original expression was the green turbaned man, in allusion to the well-known uniform of the descendants of the prophet? Turbaned surely is just the sort of word, exactly the sort of foreign and unfamiliar word that might easily be slurred over and ultimately suppressed. "There is a legend in these parts," said Lady Joan steadily, "that a great hero, hearing the colour that was sacred to his holy island insulted, really poured it over his enemy for a reply." "A legend! A fable!" cried the man in the fez, with another radiant and rational expansion of the hands. "Is it not evident that no such thing can have really happened?" "Oh, yes, it really happened," said the young lady softly. "There is not much to comfort one in this world, but there are some things. Oh, it really happened." And taking a graceful farewell of the group, she resumed her rather listless walk along the parade. End of chapter 3. Recording by Nicola K.
Of The Flying Inn. This is a LibraryVox recording. All LibraryVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit libraryvox.org. Recording by Zernaz. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. The Inn Finds Wings. Mr. Humphrey Pump stood in front of his inn once more. The cleaned and loaded gun still lay on the table, and the white sign of the ship still swung in the slight sea breeze over his head. But his leatherish features were knotted over a new problem. He held 2 letters in his hand, letters of a very different sort, but letters that pointed to the same difficult problem. The first ran, "Dear Hump, I'm so bothered that I simply must call you by the old name again. You understand, I've got to keep in with my people. Lord Ivywood is a sort of cousin of mine, and for that and for some other reasons my poor old mother would just die if I offended him. You know her heart is weak. You know everything there is to know in this county. Well, I only write to warn you that something is going to be done against your dear old inn. I don't know what these country is coming to. Only a month or 2 ago I saw a shabby old pantaloon on the beach with a green gamp, talking the craziest stuff you ever heard in your life. 3 weeks ago I heard he was lecturing at ethical societies, whatever they are, for a handsome salary. Well, when I was last at Ivywood, I must go because Mamma likes it, there was the living lunatic again, in evening dress and talking about people who really know. I mean who know better. Lord Ivywood is entirely under his influence and thinks him the greatest prophet the world has ever seen. And Lord Ivywood is not a fool. One can't help admire him. Mamma, I think, wants me to do more than admire him. I'm telling you everything, Hump, because I think perhaps this is the last honest letter I shall ever write in the world. And I warned you seriously that Lord Ivywood is sincere, which is perfectly terrible. He will be the biggest English statesman, and he does really mean to ruin the old ships. If you ever see me here again taking part in such work, I hope you may forgive me. Somebody we mentioned whom I shall never see again. I leave to your friendship. It is the second best thing I can give, and I am not sure it may be better than the first would have been. Goodbye, J.B. This letter seemed to distress Mr. Pump rather than puzzle him. It ran as follows. Sir, the Committee of the Imperial Commission of Liquor Control is directed to draw your attention to the fact that you have disregarded the Committee's communications under Section 5A of the Act for the regulation of places of public entertainment, and that you are now under Section 47C of the Act, amending the Act for the regulation of places of public entertainment aforesaid. The charges on which prosecution will be founded are as follows. Violation of subsection 23 of the Act, which enacts that no pictorial signs shall be exhibited before premises of less than the rateable value of £2,000 per annum. Violation of subsection 113 of the Act, which enacts that no liquor containing alcohol shall be sold in any inn, hotel, tavern, or public house, except when demanded under a medical certificate from one of the doctors licensed by the State Medical Council, or in the specially accepted cases of Claridge's Hotel and the Criterion Bar, where urgency has already been improved. As you have failed to acknowledge previous communications on this subject, this is to warn you that legal steps will be taken immediately. We are yours truly, Ivywood, President, J. Levison, Secretary. Mr. Humphrey Pump sat down at the table outside his inn and whistled in a way which, combined with his little whiskers, made him for the moment seem literally like an ostler. Then the very real wit and learning he had returned slowly into his face, and with his warm brown eyes he considered the cold grey sea. There was not much to be got out of the sea. Humphrey Pump might drown himself in the sea, which would be better for Humphrey Pump than being finally separated from the old ship. England might be sunk under the sea, which would be better for England than never again having such places as the old ship. But these were not serious remedies nor rationally attainable, and Pump could only feel that the sea had simply warped him as it had warped his apple trees. The sea was a dreary business altogether. There was only one figure walking on the sands. It was only when the figure drew nearer and nearer, and grew to more than human size, that he sprang to his feet with a cry. Also the level light of morning lit the man's hair, and it was red. The late King of Ithaca came casually and slowly up the slope of the beach that led to the old ship. He had landed in a boat from a battleship that could still be seen near the horizon, and he still wore the astounding uniform of apple green and silver which he had himself invented as that of a navy that had never existed much, and which now did not exist at all. He had a straight naval sword at his side, for terms of his capitulation had never required him to surrender it, and inside the uniform and beside the sword there was what there always had been, a big and rather bewildered man with rough red hair, whose misfortune was that he had good brains, but that his bodily strength and bodily passions were a little too strong for his brains. He had flung his crashing weight on the chair outside the inn before the innkeeper could find words to express his astounded pleasure in seeing him. His first words were, "Have you got any rum?" Then, as if feeling that his attitude needed explanation, he added, "I suppose I shall never be a sailor again after tonight, so I must have rum." Humphrey Pump had a talent for friendship, and understood his old friend. He went into the inn without word, and came back idly pushing or rolling with an alternate foot, as if he were playing football with two balls at once, two objects that rolled very easily. One was a big keg or barrel of rum, and the other a great solid drum of cheese. Among his 1,000 other technical tricks, he had a way of tapping a cask without a tap, or anything that could impair its revolutionary or revolving qualities. He was feeling in his pocket for the instrument with which he solved such questions, when his Irish friend suddenly sat bolt upright, as one startled out of sleep, and spoke with his strongest and most unusual brogue. "Oh, thank you, Hump, 1,000 times, and I don't really think I wanted something to drink at all. Now that I know that I can have it, I don't seem to want it at all. But what I do want," and he suddenly dashed his big fist on the little table so that one of its legs lifted and nearly snapped, "what I do want is some sort of account of what's happening in this England of yours that shan't be obviously just rubbish." "Ah," said Pump, fingering the 2 letters thoughtfully. "And what do you mean by rubbish?" "I call it rubbish," cried Patrick Dalroy, "when you put the Koran into the Bible and not the Apocrypha. And I call it rubbish when a mad parson's allowed to propose to put a crescent on St. Paul's Cathedral. I know the Turks are our allies now, but they often were before, and I never heard that Palmerston or Colin Campbell had any truck with such trash." "Lord Ivywood is very enthusiastic, I know," said Pump with a restrained amusement. He was saying only the other day at the flower show here that the time had come for a full unity between Christianity and Islam. Something called Chrislam, perhaps, said the Irishman with a moody eye. He was gazing across the grey and purple woodbines that stretched below them at the back of the inn, and into which the steep white road swept downwards and disappeared. The steep road looked like the beginning of an adventure, and he was an adventurer. "But you exaggerate, you know," went on Pump, polishing his gun, "about the crescent on St. Paul's. It wasn't exactly that. What Dr. Moole suggested, I think, was some sort of double emblem, you know, combining cross and crescent." "And Carl the Crescent," muttered Dalroy. "And you can't call Dr. Moole a parson either," went on Mr. Humphrey Pump, polishing industriously. "Why, they say he's a sort of atheist, or what they call an agnostic, like a Squire Brunton who used to bite elm trees by Marley. The grand folks have these fashions, Captain, but they've never lasted long that I know of." "I think it's serious this time," said his friend, shaking his big red head. "This is the last inn on this coast, and will be soon the last inn in England. Do you remember Saracen's Head and Plumsea along the shore there?" "I know," assented the innkeeper. "My aunt was there when he hanged his mother, but it's a charming place. I passed there just now, and it has been destroyed," said Dalroy. "Destroyed by fire?" asked Pump, pausing in his gun scrubbing. "No," said Dalroy, "destroyed by lemonade. They've taken away its license, or whatever they call it. I made a song about it which I'll sing to you now." And with an astounding air of suddenly revived spirits, he roared in a voice like thunder the following verses to a simple but spirited tune of his own invention. "The Saracen's Head looks down the lane, where we shall never drink wine again, for the wicked old women who feel well bred have turned to a tea shop. The Saracen's Head. The Saracen's Head out of Araby came, King Richard riding in arms like flame, and where he established his folk to be fed, he set up his spear and the Saracen's Head. But the Saracen's Head outlived the kings. It thought of most horrible things, of health and of soap and of standard bread and of Saracen drinks at the Saracen's Head." "Hullo!" cried Pump, with another low whistle. "Why, here comes his lordship, and I suppose that young man in the goggles is a committee or something." "Let him come," said Dalroy, and continued in a yet more earthquake bellow. "So the Saracen's Head fulfills its name. They drink no wine, it's a ridiculous game, and I shall wonder until I'm dead how it ever came into the Saracen's Head." As the last echo of this lyrical roar rolled away among the apple trees, and down the steep white road into the woods, Captain Dalroy leaned back in his chair and nodded good-humouredly to Lord Ivywood, who was standing on the lawn with his usual cold air, but with slightly compressed lips. Behind him was a dark young man with double eye-glasses and a number of printed papers in his hand, presumably J. Levison, secretary. In the road outside stood a small group of three which struck Pump as strangely incongruous, like a group in a three-act farce. The first was a police inspector in uniform, the second was a workman in a leather apron, more or less like a carpenter, and the third was an old man in a scarlet Turkish fez, but otherwise dressed in very fashionable English clothes in which he did not seem very comfortable. He was explaining something about the inn to the policeman and the carpenter, who appeared to be restraining their amusement. "Fine song that, my lord," said Dalroy with cheerful egotism. "I'll sing you another," and he cleared his throat. "Mr. Pump," said Lord Ivywood in his bell-like and beautiful voice, "I thought I would come in person, if only to make it clear that every indulgence has been shown to you. The mere date of this inn brings it within the statute of 1909. It was erected when my great-grandfather was lord of the manor here, though I believe it then bore a different name, and—" "Ah, my lord," broke in Pump with a sigh, "I'd rather deal with your great-grandfather, I would, though he married 100 negresses instead of one, than see a gentleman of your family taking away a poor man's livelihood. The act is specially designed in the interests of the relief of poverty," proceeded Lord Ivywood in an unruffled manner, "and its final advantages will accrue to all citizens alike." He turned for an instant to the dark secretary, saying, "You have the second report," and received a folded paper in answer. "It is here fully explained," said Lord Ivywood, putting on his elderly eye-glasses, "that the purpose of the Act is largely to protect the savings of the more humble and necessitous classes. I find in paragraph 3 We strongly advise that the deleterious element of alcohol be made illegal, save in such places as the government may especially exempt for parliamentary or other public reasons, and that the provocative and demoralizing display on inn signs be strictly forbidden except in cases thus especially exempted. The absence of such temptations will, in our opinion, do much to improve the precarious financial conditions of the working class. That disposes, I think, of any such suggestion as Mr. Pump's, that our inevitable acts of social reform are in any sense oppressive. To Mr. Pump's prejudice, it may appear for the moment to bear hardly upon him, but— and here Lord Ivywood's voice took one of its moving oratorical turns. What better proof could we desire of the insidiousness of the sleepy poison we denounce, what better evidence could we offer of the civic corruption that we seek to cure, than the very fact that good and worthy men of established repute in the county can, by having in such places as these, become so stagnant and sodden and unsocial, whether through the fumes of wine, or through meditations as maudlin about the past, that they consider the case solely as their own case, and laugh at the long agony of the poor? Captain Dalroy had been studying Ivywood with a very bright blue eye, and he spoke now much more quietly than he generally did. "Excuse me one moment, my lord," he said, "but there was one point in your important explanation which I am not sure I've got right. Do I understand you to say that though signboards are to be generally abolished, yet where, if anywhere, they are retained, the right to sell fermented liquor will be retained also? In other words, though an Englishman may at last find only one ensign left in England, yet if the place has an ensign, it will also have your gracious permission to be really an inn?" Lord Ivywood had an admirable command of temper, which had helped him much in his career as a statesman. He did not waste time in wrangling about the captain's locus stand in the matter. He replied quite simply, "Yes, your statement of the facts is correct. Whenever I find an ensign permitted by the police, I may go in and ask for a glass of beer, also permitted by the police." "If you find any such, yes," answered Ivywood quite temperately, "but we hope soon to have removed them altogether." Captain Patrick Dalroy rose enormously from his seat with a sort of stretch, and yawned. "Well, Hump," he said to his friend, "the best thing, it seems to me, is to take the important things with us." With two sight-staggering kicks he sent the keg of rum and the rolled cheese flying over the fence in such a direction that they bolted on the descending road and rolled more and more rapidly toward the dark woods, into which the path disappeared. Then he gripped the pole of the ensign, shook it twice, and plucked it out of the turf like a tuft of grass. It had all happened before anyone could move, but as he strode out into the road the policeman ran forward. Dalroy smacked him flat across the face and chest with the wooden signboard so as to send him flying into the ditch on the other side of the road. Then turning on to the man in the fez, he poked him with the end of the pole so sharply in his new white waistcoat and watch chain as to cause him to sit down suddenly in the road, looking very serious and thoughtful. The dark secretary made a movement of rescue, but Humphrey Pump, with a cry, caught up his gun from the table and pointed it at him, which so alarmed J. Levison's secretary as to cause him to almost double up with his emotions. The next moment Pump, with his gun under his arm, was scampering down the hill after the captain, who was scampering after the barrel and the cheese. Before the policeman had struggled out of the ditch, they had all disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Lord Ivywood, who had remained firm through the scene, without a sign of fear or impatience, or I will add amusement, held up his hand and stopped the policeman in his pursuit. "We should only make ourselves and the law look ridiculous," he said, "by pursuing those ludicrous rowdies. No, they can't escape or do any real harm in the state of modern communications. What is far more important, gentlemen, is to destroy their stores and their base. Under the Act of 1911, we have a right to confiscate and destroy any property in an inn where the law has been violated." And he stood for hours on the lawn, watching the smashing of bottles and the breaking up of casks, and feeding on fanatical pleasure, the pleasure his strange, cold, courageous nature could not get from food or wine or women. End of The Inn Finds Wings. Recording by Zernaz.
Five of The Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. The Flying In by G. K. Chesterton. Chapter 5. The Astonishment of the Agent. Lord Ivywood shared the mental weakness of most men who have fed on books. He ignored not the value, but the very existence of other forms of information. Thus Humphrey Pump was perfectly aware that Lord Ivywood considered him an ignorant man who carried a volume of Pickwick and could not be got to read any other book. But Lord Ivywood was quite unaware that Humphrey never looked at him without thinking that he could be most successfully hidden in a wood of small beeches, as his gray-brown hair and sallow ashen face exactly reproduced the three predominant tints of such a sylvan twilight. Mr. Pump, I fear, had sometimes partaken of partridge or pheasant in his early youth, under circumstances in which Lord Ivywood was not only unconscious of the hospitality he was dispensing, but would have sworn that it was physically impossible for anyone to elude the vigilance of his efficient system of game-keeping. But it is very unwise in one who counts himself superior to physical things to talk about physical impossibility. Lord Ivywood was in error, therefore, when he said that the fugitives could not possibly escape in modern England. You can do a great many things in modern England, if you have noticed. Some things, in fact, which others know by pictures or current speech. If you know, for instance, that most roadside hedges are taller and denser than they look, and that even the largest man lying just behind them takes up far less room than you would suppose, if you know that many natural sounds are much more like each other than the enlightened ear can believe, as in the case of wind in leaves and of the sea. If you know that it is easier to walk in socks than in boots, if you know how to take hold of the ground, if you know that the proportion of dogs who will bite a man under any circumstances is rather less than the proportion of men who will murder you in a railway carriage, if you know that you need not be drowned even in a river unless the tide is very strong, and unless you practice putting yourself into the special attitudes of a suicide, if you know that country stations have objectless extra waiting rooms that nobody ever goes into, and if you know that country folk will forget you if you speak to them, but talk about you all day if you don't. By the exercise of these and other arts and sciences, Humphrey Pump was able to guide his friend across country, mostly in the character of trespasser, and occasionally in that of something like housebreaker, and eventually, with sign, keg, cheese, and all, to step out of a black pine wood onto a white road in a part of the country where they would not be sought for the present. Opposite them was a cornfield, and on their right, in the shades of the pine trees, a cottage, a very tumble-down cottage that seemed to have collapsed under its own thatch. The red-haired Irishman's face wore a curious smile. He stuck the inn sign erect in the road, and went and hammered on the door. It was opened tremulously by an old man with a face so wrinkled that the wrinkles seemed more distinctly graven than the features themselves, which seemed lost in the labyrinth of them. He might have crawled out of the hole in a gnarled tree, and he might have been 1,000 years old. He did not seem to notice the signboard, which stood rather to the left of the door, and what life remained in his eyes seemed to awake in wonder at Dalroy's stature and strange uniform, and the sword at his side. "I beg your pardon," said the captain, courteously. "I fear my uniform startles you. It is Lord Ivywood's livery. All his servants are to dress like this. In fact, I understand the tenants also, and even yourself, perhaps. Excuse my sword. Lord Ivywood is very particular that every man should have a sword. You know his beautiful, eloquent way of putting his views. How can we profess," he was saying to me yesterday while I was brushing his trousers, "how can we profess that all men are brothers while we refuse to them the symbol of manhood? Or with what assurance can we claim it as a movement of modern emancipation to deny the citizen that which has in all ages marked the difference between the free man and the slave? Nor need we anticipate any such barbaric abuses as my honorable friend who is cleaning the knives has prophesied, for this gift is a sublime act of confidence in your universal passion for the severe splendors of peace, and he that has the right to strike is he who has learnt to spare." Talking all this nonsense with extreme rapidity and vast oratorical flourishes of the hand, Captain Dalroy proceeded to trundle both the big cheese and the cask of rum into the house of the astonished cottager, Mr. Pump following with a grim placidity and his gun under his arm. "Lord Ivywood," said Dalroy, setting the rum cask with a bump on the plain deal table, "wishes to take wine with you, or more strictly speaking, rum. Don't you run away, my friend, with any of these stories about Lord Ivywood being opposed to drink. 3-bottle Ivywood, we call him in the kitchen. But it must be rum, nothing but rum for the Ivywoods. Wine may be a mocker, he was saying the other day, and I particularly noted the phrasing, which seemed to be very happy even for his lordship. He was standing at the top of the steps, and I stopped cleaning them to make a note of it. Wine may be a mocker, strong drink may be raging, but nowhere in the sacred pages will you find one word of censure of the sweeter spirit, sacred to them that go down to the sea in ships. No tongue of priest and prophet has ever lifted to break the sacred silence of Holy Writ about rum. He then explained to me," went on Dalroy, signing to Pump to tap the cask according to his own technical secret, "that the great tip for avoiding any bad results that a bottle or two of rum might have on young and inexperienced people was to eat cheese with it, particularly this kind of cheese that I have here. I've forgotten its name." "Cheddar," said Pump quite gravely. "But mind you," continued the captain, almost ferociously, shaking his big finger in warning at the aged man, "mind you, no bread with the cheese. All the devastating ruin wrought by cheese in the once happy homes of this country has been due to the reckless and insane experiment of eating bread with it. You'll get no bread from me, my friend. Indeed, Lord Ivywood has given directions that the allusion to this ignorant and depraved habit shall be eliminated from the Lord's Prayer. Have a drink." He had already poured out a little of the spirit into 2 thick tumblers and a broken teacup, which he had induced the aged man to produce, and now solemnly pledged him. "Thank ye kindly, sir," said the old man, using his cracked voice for the first time. Then he drank, and his old face changed as if it were an old horn lantern in which the flame began to rise. "Ar," he said, "my son he be a sailor." "I wish him a happy voyage," said the captain, "and I'll sing you a song about the first sailor there ever was in the world, and who, as Lord Ivywood acutely observes, lived before the time of rum." He sat down on a wooden chair and lifted his loud voice once more, beating on the table with the broken teacup. "Old Noah, he had an ostrich farm and fowls on the greatest scale. He ate his egg with a ladle in an egg cup big as a pail. And the soup he took was elephant soup, and the fish he took was whale. But they all were small to the cellar he took when he set out to sail. And Noah he often said to his wife when he sat down to dine, 'I don't care where the water goes if it doesn't get into the wine.' The cataract of the cliff of heaven fell blinding off the brink, as if it would wash the stars away as suds go down a sink. The 7 heavens came roaring down for the throats of hell to drink, and Noah he cocked his eye and said, 'It looks like rain, I think.' The water has drowned the Matterhorn as deep as a Mendip wine, and I don't care where the water goes if it doesn't get into the wine. But Noah he sinned, and we have sinned, on tipsy feet we trod, till a great big black teetotaler was sent to us for a rod. And you can't get wine at a PSA, or chapel, or Eisteddfod, for the curse of water has come again because of the wrath of God. And water is on the bishop's board and the higher thinker's shrine. But I don't care where the water goes if it doesn't get into the wine." "Lord Ivywood's favorite song," concluded Mr. Patrick Dalroy, drinking. "Sing us a song yourself." Rather to the surprise of the 2 humorists, the old gentleman actually began, in a quavering voice, to chant: "King George that lives in London town, I hope they will defend his crown, and Bonaparte be quite put down on Christmas Day in the morning. Old Squire is gone to the meet today, all in his—" It is perhaps fortunate for the rapidity of this narrative that the old gentleman's favorite song, which consists of 47 verses, was interrupted by a curious incident. The door of the cottage opened, and a sheepish-looking man in corduroys stood silently in the room for a few seconds, and then said, without preface or further explanation, "For ale." "I beg your pardon?" inquired the polite captain. "For ale," said the man with solidity, then catching sight of Humphrey, seemed to find a few more words in his vocabulary. "Morning, Mr. Pump. Didn't know as how you'd moved the old ship." Mr. Pump, with a twist of a smile, pointed to the old man whose song had been interrupted. "Mr. Mame's seeing after it now, Mr. Gowl," said Pump, with the strict etiquette of the countryside. But he's got nothing but this rum in stock as yet. Better nowt, said the laconic Mr. Gowell, and put down some money in front of the aged Mame, who eyed it wonderingly. As he was turning with a farewell, and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, the door once more moved, letting in white sunlight, and a man in a red neckerchief. "Morning, Mr. Mame. Morning, Mr. Pump. Morning, Mr. Gowell," said the man in the red neckerchief. "Morning, Mr. Coote," said the other three, one after the other. "Have some rum, Mr. Coote?" asked Humphrey Pump, genially. "That's all Mr. Mame's got just now." Mr. Coote also had a little rum, and also laid a little money under the rather vague gaze of the venerable cottager. Mr. Coote was just proceeding to explain that these were bad times, but if you saw a sign, you were all right still. A lawyer up at Grunton Abbot had told him so, when the company was increased and greatly excited by the arrival of a boisterous and popular tinker, who ordered glasses all round, and said he had his donkey and cart outside. A prolonged, rich, and confused conversation about the donkey and cart then ensued, in which the most varied views were taken of their merits, and it gradually began to dawn on Dalroy that the tinker was trying to sell them. An idea suited to the romantic opportunism of his present absurd career suddenly swept over his mind, and he rushed out to look at the cart and donkey. The next moment he was back again, asking the tinker what his price was, and almost in the same breath offering a much bigger price than the tinker would have dreamed of asking. This was considered, however, as a lunacy specially allowed to gentlemen. The tinker had some more rum on the strength of the payment, and then Dalroy, offering his excuses, sealed up the cask, and took it and the cheese to be stowed in the bottom of the cart. The money, however, he still left lying in shining silver and copper before the silver beard of old Mame. No one acquainted with the quaint and often wordless camaraderie of the English poor will require to be told that they all went out and stared at him as he loaded the cart and saw to the harness of the donkey, all except the old cottager, who sat as if hypnotized by the sight of the money. While they were standing there, they saw coming down the white-hot road, where it curled over the hill, a figure that gave them no pleasure, even when it was a mere marching black spot in the distance. It was a Mr. Bulrose, the agent of Lord Ivywood's estates. Mr. Bulrose was a short, square man, with a broad, square head, with ridges of close, black curls on it, with a heavy, frog-like face, and starting, suspicious eyes. A man with a good silk hat, but a square business jacket. Mr. Bulrose was not a nice man. The agent on that sort of estate hardly ever is a nice man. The landlord often is, and even Lord Ivywood had an arctic magnanimity of his own, which made most people want, if possible, to see him personally. But Mr. Bulrose was petty. Every really practical tyrant must be petty. He evidently failed to understand the commotion in front of Mr. Mame's partly collapsed cottage, but he felt there must be something wrong about it. He wanted to get rid of the cottage altogether, and had not, of course, the faintest intention of giving the cottager any compensation for it. He hoped the old man would die, but in any case he could easily clear him out if it became suddenly necessary, for he could not possibly pay the rent for this week. The rent was not very much, but it was immeasurably too much for the old man, who had no conceivable way of borrowing or earning it. That is where the chivalry of our aristocratic land system comes in. "Goodbye, my friends," the enormous man in the fantastic uniform was saying. "All roads lead to rum, as Lord Ivywood said in one of his gayer moments, and we hope to be back soon, establishing a first-class hotel here, of which prospectuses will soon be sent out." The heavy, frog-like face of Mr. Bulrose, the agent, grew uglier with astonishment, and the eyes stood out more like a snail's than a frog's. The indefensible allusion to Lord Ivywood would, in any case, have caused a choleric intervention, if it had not been swallowed up in the earthquake suggestion of an unlicensed hotel on the estate. This again would have effected the explosion, if that and everything else had not been struck still and rigid by the sight of a solid wooden signpost already erected outside old Mame's miserable cottage. "I've got him now," muttered Mr. Bulrose. "He can't possibly pay, and out he shall go." And he walked swiftly towards the door of the cottage, almost at the same moment that Dalroy went to the donkey's head, as if to lead it off along the road. "Look here, my man!" burst out Mr. Bulrose, the instant he was inside the cottage. "You've cooked yourself this time. His lordship has been a great deal too indulgent with you, but this is going to be the end of it. The insolence of what you've done outside, especially when you know his lordship's wishes in such things, has just put the lid on." He stopped a moment and sneered. "So unless you happen to have the exact rent down to a farthing or two about you, out you go. We're sick of your sort." In a very awkward and fumbling manner, the old man pushed a heap of coins across the table. Mr. Bulrose sat down suddenly on the wooden chair with his silk hat on, and began counting them furiously. He counted them once, he counted them twice, and he counted them again. Then he stared at them more steadily than the cottager had done. "Where did you get this money?" he asked in a thick, gross voice. "Did you steal it?" "I ain't very spry for stealing," said the old man in quavering comedy. Bulrose looked at him and then at the money, and remembered with fury that Ivywood was a just, though cold, magistrate on the bench. "Well, anyhow," he cried in a hot, heady way, "we've got enough against you to turn you out of this. Haven't you broken the law, my man, to say nothing of the regulations for tenants? in sticking up that fancy sign of yours outside the cottage, eh?" The tenant was silent. "Eh?" reiterated the agent. "Arr," replied the tenant. "Have you or have you not a signboard outside this house?" shouted Bullrose, hammering the table. The tenant looked at him for a long time with a patient and venerable face, and then said, "Mebbe yes, mebbe no." "I'll mebbe you," cried Mr. Bullrose, springing up and sticking his silk hat on the back of his head. "I don't know whether you people are too drunk to see anything, but I saw the thing with my own eyes out in the road. Come out and deny it if you dare." "Arr," said Mr. Mame dubiously. He tottered after the agent, who flung open the door with a businesslike fury, and stood outside on the threshold. He stood there quite a long time, and he did not speak. Deep in the hardened mud of his materialistic mind, there had stirred two things that were its ancient enemies: the old fairy tale, in which everything can be believed; the new skepticism, in which nothing can be believed, not even one's own eyes. There was no sign, nor sign of a fane, in the landscape. On the withered face of the old man Mame there was a faint renewal of that laughter that has slept since the Middle Ages. End of chapter 5. Recording by Bill Moseley, Frellsburg, Texas, USA.